Hello everyone, today we make a brief history of the Lordship of Ireland. In Irish, Tiernas na Heirean. I will butcher all the Gaelic words today, for which you will hopefully forgive me. In Latin, it was known as the Dominium Hiberniae, up to a certain point, because today we stop to the foundation, properly, of the Irish Kingdom, 1542. Seigneurie de Ireland in Norman. As a matter of fact, the Lordship of Ireland is sometimes referred to retroactively as Norman Ireland, in fact, right? And this was essentially the part of the island ruled by the King of England, that was styled thus as the Lord of Ireland, and controlled fundamentally by loyal Anglo-Norman lords between, in fact, the Anglo-Norman conquest, or Cambro-Norman, if you prefer, by a degree, of Ireland between 1177, albeit some groups of Normans actually were present there before, more of that later, and 1542. Today, naturally, we will just style out very, very simply a bit just of political institutional history of the Lordship of Ireland, but I'm looking forward to make some European historical region series on the main, in fact, polities that de facto remained, in fact, in Ireland, that, as we will see, remained quite fragmented and disorderly, we can easily say, especially after the Anglo-Norman conquest, given that the high kingship of Ireland, as you know, was already reflecting the scarcely centralized reality of the land, which, as you know, was somehow backwards compared to not just the continent, but Britain, and that, however, was striving right through its institutions to establish a higher lordship over the entire island, right? So there is also the Norman invasion of Ireland that deserves, from a political and military point of view, another video. This is taking place between 1169 and 1171. We'll see in a while. The Lordship of Ireland per se was also a papal fief, granted to the Angevin kings of England by the popes via the Laudabiliter bull that today is not preserved anymore, but did exist, right, and fit the broader Gregorian view, in fact, as Christendom being somehow under the direction of the papal monarchy. As the Lord of Ireland was also the King of England, he was represented locally by the chief governor of Ireland that ruled essentially from the castle of Dublin, and who was variously known as the justiciar, the lieutenant, the Lord Lieutenant, or Lord Deputy, on behalf of the English monarch. The kings of England claimed lordship naturally over the whole island. This is something which retrospectively the Anglo-Saxons had kind of always done, meaning that in the moment in which they set foot in Britain, it was extremely clear to them how the entire British Isles, I know that some Irish will be triggered by the definition, but I include Ireland. In fact, I can say, a medieval playlist named Medieval Britain and Ireland to distinguish. But we're under their control, under their overlordship, and that's something that objectively the Celtic fringe was by different degree. In reality, however, the English king's rule, even during the period of the medieval period of the lordship, was extending only to some parts of the island in a direct way, right, with a direct control occupation. The rest of the island, referred to subsequently as Gaelic Ireland, remained under the control of various Gaelic Irish kingdoms or chiefdoms who were often at war with the Anglo-Normans. However, a huge deal, as we will see and as it's widely known, of the Lordship of Ireland was the essentially grey area, the middle ground between the Gaels, in fact, in the Anglo-Normans, in the form of essentially Gaelized Anglo-Norman rulers who de facto came to control the island, in part still on behalf of the English monarchy, but sometimes like on their own account, largely decentralized reality that had emerged properly as such since the beginning, and that's the reason why eventually the English kings properly invaded the island and claiming overlordship on it. And at the same time, of course, there was a Normanization of the Gaels as well that somehow was not anew, because there is properly an Hiberno-Norse period that you can identify in the previous centuries, and so the island was already somehow colonized. The most important modern Irish cities are essentially foundation or refoundation of the Viking ring forts that were scattered, in fact, in most strategic locations, the ones that were better, suited for also international exchange, that were stripped by the conquerors from the Gaelic control. This is interesting because we have seen last year a couple of videos essentially how the Irish had been quite active in terms of piracy and interference in Britain. We have made videos about Gaelic warfare. There's even a playlist if you're interested in that. And as you know, you can't quite even draw a difference between in fact, the broader Scots, meant literally as those that straddled across Ireland and eventually northern Britain, so much that Scotland is named after them, aside from the various interpretations on how the thing happened, also from Pictish times and so on, because we made video about the Picts and early and medieval Scotland, early medieval and medieval Scotland in general. Today we will not specifically discuss that. Needless to say, the situation in the island remained somehow strained, right? This was a decentralized province of the Angevin kingdom. The English will fundamentally even lose control during the late Middle Ages on various parts of Ireland because of the broader crisis of the 14th century, for example, but also because it was objectively a secondary theater, right, that also didn't present much of a threat per se, even in a particularly autonomistic direction, and or just because of the local resources of some Gaelic resurgence, right? This had been the Gaelic deal fundamentally, that aside from piracy, etc., the possibility of establishing a higher power capable of offending structurally, systemically, threatening even, I don't know, the English or the Scots was not a thing, right? It wouldn't remain that. I made a video about medieval Western Highlanders that fundamentally, embodied pretty well what was just like the situation in the same Ireland right across the strait. And you realize that these were peoples that for a long time kept living and fighting with the same medieval styles, even well through the modern age, right? Not that they weren't up to date whenever they could put their hands on modern gear equipment, and they were pretty skilled in that, and there were lots of mercenaries that in fact found from these areas had found employment abroad during the modern age. But locally, right, we're talking essentially just about clanic realities that essentially camped, always fighting against each other in a vicious way. In a sense, the Anglo-Norman presence helped catalyzing Irish politics and institutions towards a more unitary direction, right? But of course, as a foreign domination, the consequences of which you have, we are all acquainted to, even very modern times. That's another chapter that passes also in the last century with the Irish independence and all these things. But we will see that perhaps in another video, because they are interesting from a military point of view, and they're not just anecdotal. As we were saying before, the area of the Lordship of Ireland under English rule and law grew and shrank over time in chronological order, and reached, in fact, its greatest extent in the late 13th, early 14th century, in line with the peak of the great full medieval civilization, we could say. The lordship then went into decline, brought by, in fact, the general trend of the continent, but that locally was definitely catalyzed by, for example, the invasion of the island by Robert Bruce in 1315-18 that overlapped with the Great Famine of 1315-17, plus naturally the Black Death of the 40s of the century. And the former invasion especially struck the area around Dublin, that was fundamentally the so-called Pale, from palisade, right? It's a term, in fact, of Norman and Latin origin that had come to define the space around Dublin, where most of the Anglo-Norman dominion was based, was the most advanced area of the island, of course, the closer to Britain, the one from which the same invasion had de facto taken place, or at least, where most of the power immediately came to be concentrated in. And the farms were disrupted on that occasion. Naturally, there was always this possibility of triggering a Gaelic revolt against the English rule, and that's what the Bruce was practically doing, as you know, also just after the victory at Bannockburn during the Wars of Scottish Independence, that we will see in detail also at some other point. This meant that the political situation of Ireland, even in the same Norman part, was particularly fluid. The Normans essentially imported their feudal system, which, albeit gluing together larger estates that were organized, as you will see now, according properly to the Anglo-Norman mode, and it was far more advanced administratively, militarily, and so on, was still importantly decentralized compared to England. So there was a balance, as we were recalling before, between the vicissitudes of the English monarchy, that was, especially the moment of the conquest and later, actually busy with much bigger problems, and also later on, also the British ones internally were definitely more relevant than the ones of Ireland. But that still managed, in fact, to create some headaches to the English, as far as the same Anglo-Norman lords could essentially root in the island and starting to carry out a pretty autonomous, if not independent, policy, which could damage the English crown. In fact, these conquerors did pretty much what had been done by the Normans while seizing England, with the difference that royal authority wasn't quite checking them per se. So they carved out earldoms for themselves. It's worth mentioning that Ireland was not completely shired until the 17th century. So, as we will see now, properly in the Gaelic areas, things went much unchanged for most of the Middle Ages. However, the Anglo-Norman lords could still use the standard English administration system to strengthen their own authority locally, becoming as powerful as some native Gaelic kings that were still existing, of course, and also siding with them at a point where these Anglo-Normans wanted to rebel to the Lord of Ireland, etc. In fact, this happened especially among those Anglo-Normans that had become more Gaelicized, as they were seeking for support by the locals in their endeavors. This, however, doesn't mean that they weren't still another thing compared to the natives, right? Even though they began to essentially adopt also all the impressive knowledge of Gaelic tradition and, in fact, models of rule, etc., and lifestyle by a degree, but they were still pretty, pretty haughty as far as their origins were concerned. They saw exactly in the same Gaelic fashion, of course, as those who had come and won over, right, these other people. Thus, there is hardly anything more brutal than the way these lords ruled over the rest of the population, not differently from the Teutonic Knights over the Baltic peoples they had conquered. And this is ingrained just in the nobiliar mindset of the time that, of course, considers their own blood as properly superior to the one of these other creatures literally living in the woods and still not, the degree of, in fact, of Irish primitiveness is striking compared to practically anything you can see up to almost the steppes in Europe, crossing in fact, the more developed areas of the continent. And it's exactly, however, this primitiveness and brutality of the Gaelic culture that manages to hold on, right, and to carry out continuous guerrilla over the centuries, you can argue, and to gradually recover even parts of that had been originally, in fact, controlled by the Anglo-Normans, whether, again, autonomous from the lordship or not. The English government attempted to curb the Gaelicization of the Anglo-Normans because they were aware, of course, of what such territorial and cultural rooting could actually lead to, as it would. And they passed, as a consequence, the statutes of Kilkenny in 1366, which specifically forbade English settlers from taking up Irish law, language, custom, and dress, right? Which in medieval times, and especially in a context like Ireland, where the divide between the conquerors and the conquered was, at least originally, relatively evident, right? Kept marking, in fact, these set of political and social differences. Consider that not just the Cambro-Normans settled in Ireland, but historically, as you know, together with the English, the Welsh, the Scots, but even the Flemish settled here, because Ireland was just essentially seen as a part of these British isles that the Normans had managed to hegemonize, and so all the Norman colonization that brought with it, as you know, some even Breton elements, etc., with them, simply brought all these communities to enter the new group. It's interesting to mention the Bretons, because in Ireland was called at the time of the lordship the Breton law, right? It was somehow even similar already, even the ecclesiastical administration, as we will see now, to the British one, right? At least there was an original phase that we discussed of, Irish properly Christianity, especially the monastic for the administrative. The ecclesiastical administration had originally developed in a different way from the Roman Germanic one that was somehow very precisely based on the diocese in the city, whereas in Ireland, given that there weren't cities, technically it was the monastery that came the center of the diocese. This changed a lot of things, but it was also a long-term process in which, starting from the Anglo-Norman conquest, the Church of Rome importantly interfered. As we were saying before, this period ends with the kingdom of the kingdom of Ireland, at least in 1542, where, of course, much of this dynamics continued, but in another era that today we do not take in consideration. So the authority of the Lordship of Ireland's government was seldom extended throughout the island at any time during its existence, but was also restricted to the aforementioned Pale area around Dublin, and some provincial towns, including the aforementioned better connected ones of Cork, Limerick, Waterford, Wexford, together with their hinterlands. The political geography of the island is as interesting as complex and complicated because of the lack of centralization, the clinic presence that was essentially evolving towards a more lordly one in its own account, properly with certain territorial domination, some of which were kind of also already old, right? That they are known since historical times in Ireland, and that perhaps we will see better again in the aforementioned European historical region series, because they deserve individually, right? They were also modest in power, of course. And the Anglo-Norman conquest of Ireland, famously enough, stemmed from the decision of a Leinster dynasty, Diarmaid MacMurrough-Kavanagh, which is anglicized as Diarmaid MacMurrough, to bring in a Norman knight based in Wales that, of course, was just closer to the Irish affairs by geographical proximity, but also considering that Wales had always been a sort of gateway for this kind of Celtic fringe to eventually enter central Britain for raiding, etc. This is the moment of the anarchy, right? We made a video about the Angevins just some weeks ago. So in that strained context, of course, not just you see, if you remember, that essentially the English barons settle in the Welsh marches, of course, participating together with Welsh forces in the broader process of destructuration of the English monarchy, because from the Midlands, especially, most of the resistance to the Saxon south had always been the thing since, in fact, the early history of the Kingdom of England. But such divides were affecting the same Ireland that had come to be influenced, at least in the most developed kind of, in fact, international centers, by the same English affairs. Diarmaid MacMurrough had been essentially expelled by the High King of Ireland from the island, and because of some of the usual quarrels between the Gaelic clansmen, and siding with Richard de Clare, the second Earl of Pembroke, alias Strongbow, so this Cambro-Norman knight, he managed to regain his throne in battle in Ireland, and therefore becoming a fifth column of the, at least at this point, of the Anglo-Normans in Ireland. We should point out that even though when we talk about the Anglo-Norman conquest of Ireland, we're mostly looking at the at Henry II, so properly at an Angevin dynasty, and largely speaking, at all Norman families that had settled in Britain after 1066. The same aforementioned Hiberno-Norse period tells you how already felt was in general the Norman presence broadly meant in the area, right? The Normans had settled themselves as colonists in Normandy, in the Western Frankish kingdom, as much as others had done in Ireland, in a much wilder reality, but still fundamentally stripping the Irish of important control of as you have seen, of the essentially of the coastal areas, of the most important ones, and had done so also by importantly altering the Gaelic warfare that up to that time was allegedly very backwards, and at least maybe there are some exaggerations regarding especially the lack of particular technology. Technology existed, it's just that it wasn't used in the scale elsewhere, because it was just a political social system to be, yes, brutally primitive, and remaining so throughout this time. So the coast had already known what this broader Norse maritime dominion had been about. The Normans had eventually become Franks in everything when we talk about the Duchy of Normandy, but in general they had kept relations with Britain, with Ireland, even throughout, in fact, the 10th, 11th century before the invasion. So you can argue that all these countries, including Scotland, for example, had always been somehow hegemonized by the Normans, especially after the conquest, but already receiving an important degree of Normanization in the previous centuries. And just like in Ireland, what you see in Scotland is that the most advanced areas in the lowlands are essentially the ones that are already very, not just anglicized, importantly, from a cultural point of view, but later, in fact, Normanized, right? And the English kings exercised, essentially, as you know, an important right of interference in the Scottish affairs. Before Henry II, no English king had, however, set foot ever in Ireland, right? So that's literally an important step in this timeline, because the place was so, again, inhospitable in many ways that properly the need even to invade it and occupy it up to a certain point where, in fact, the Norman system could manage to exploit the local resources satisfactorily had not been felt. That Ireland had even an obscure relation with the Roman Empire, etc., because there wasn't really much in terms of profitable resources, land exploitation, etc. And in these 12th century, in which, of course, most of Europe is awakening, and Ireland is doing so timidly as well. Within feudalism, in these fringes, as you see here, the Anglo-Normans, not just the guys living, in Kent, are particularly interested in the opportunities that can arise, because at the end of the day, it's always people, land, right? All stuff that you can successfully exploit, especially if you are a 12th century Western knight that is simply existing in function of the systematic subjugation and or extermination of large groups of people, together with actually a very good idea of how to manage them, right? Also from a from an economic point of view, to neural point of view. And the reason why Henry II of England actually invades Ireland is not much, in fact, to carry out a grand style, systematic, intensive conquest of the Irish. It's rather to control the aforementioned Richard de Clare, Strongbow, that succeeding in reinstalling MacMurrough has essentially created an impressive lordship in Ireland. And given that this guy was the second Earl of Pembroke, again, so a vassal of the English king, naturally Henry thought that demanding his due as the overlord of the guy was a way to avoid essentially a competitor Norman state, let's put it in this way, in Ireland. And again, during moments of civil strifes, of essentially what had been, as we've seen during the anarchy, a fragmentation of the Angevin Empire, and on a smaller scale, the same England was literally divided in two, and essentially in a deadlock that was just solved politically and not strategically by dynastic successory reasons, right? The death of Stephen, a son, and Stephen himself, and thus the victory of the Plantagenets that somehow reunified the system. The barons, which were, however, pretty, slippery as far as the Angevin attempts of centralization were concerned. This aspect in general of, Strongbow's lordship is fascinating because it does show that the system was already open, first of all, to Normanization, but also that there was enough resources and power base in areas such as the Pale, Dublin, etc., to represent a meaningful polity in the broader scheme of things, right? Consider that Ireland had actually hosted Anglo-Saxon refugees in 1066, and at that point William the Conqueror had been upset regarding the possibility of a, in fact, counter-offensive from the island, as much as from Flanders, where other Anglo-Saxons had fled, that could overthrow his power, right? So this may seem paradoxical, as the Irish, as we were saying before, had say been roughly involved in Britain mostly to the destabilization of the local kingdom. But as we were saying before, especially the Midlanders were normally just less loyal, also during the Norman, the Angevin civil wars, to what was becoming de facto the London government, and had historically, think about Mercia, Northumbria, sided with Vikings, with Gaels, with Picts, Scots, etc., to the detriment of the richer South. But the latter would anyhow emerge imperially in Britain, and already, as it already was by that time, by the way, the major power from centuries. The move of Henry II was successful, even though, again, there was not like a direct control over the entire system, but it did favor indirectly also the stabilization of South Wales, as the monarchy could essentially direct the Normanization of Ireland from these areas, and essentially by organizing the enterprise logistically, etc., could essentially strengthen its control over this British province, right? Opening, say, the new routes to Ireland, managing them, and also making thus the island more dependent on Britain. Now, from 1155, Henry also claimed that Pope Adrian IV had given him authorization also to reform the Irish Church in the moment which the control of the island was assumed. Religious practices and ecclesiastical organization in Ireland had already changed from the divergent structures that had characterized the early centuries of the local church, right, from the other areas of Europe, right? But it is true that the Irish church had remained kind of out of a great part of the direct control of the Holy See. Further, the former Irish church had never sent its dues, the tithes, to Rome, which was another big deal. And, the popes, again, were not just counting on Irish resources, and the country was relatively peripheral to basically all the major European affairs. But in the moment in which, of course, Henry II invaded the island in 1171, entailed the possibility of consolidating further, properly on a Norman base, which entailed the enforcement of the continental ecclesiastical administration, and thus the capacity of consolidating a greater political and territorial control, right? This was valid for Henry as much as the other Norman lords that were naturally interested in kind of monopolizing control on their ecclesiastical foundations locally, and in the typical privatistic patrimonial way that the continental lords were habituated to feudalism. And in the process, Henry accepted the fealty of the Gaelic kings at Dublin, right, in November 1171, summoning the Synod of Cashel in 1172, the latter bringing specifically the Irish Church into conformity with English and European norms. This naturally would take time to implement, but the officialization of this passage was sanctioned immediately after the formal conquest, the establishment of the lordship. Plus, in 1175, the Treaty of Windsor was agreed by Henry II and Ruadri wa Conchobar, which would be the O'Connors, High King of Ireland, right? A power that de facto remained. That there are still today kind of properly some dynasts of Ireland that are just random guys living in a farm somewhere, but that are objectively the descendants from these kings that had traditionally either monopolized or somehow associated their prestige, their bloodline to the kingship and so on. And this properly highlighted the fact that the entire previous system of Irish kingship, that properly the High King was under the English lordship, and this somehow pictures clearly what the racial strength involved practically was. Of course, the High Kingship of Ireland was connected with the more developed places that also the Anglo-Normans settled in, so it couldn't quite avoid to the threat of annihilation, or at least some kind of still control of the same institution to oppose the English lordship further. The popes asserted the right to grant sovereignty over islands to different monarchs on the basis of the donation of Constantine. That in the 15th century, the same papal humanists proved to be, of course, a forgery, but that's a story that, in fact, is often referred as, oh, look, the popes were faking things. Actually, if you don't know what's the story behind the donation of Constantine, also where it was actually forged, and what normally powers forged at the time, you couldn't quite understand it closely. Naturally, in Anglo-Saxon historiography, popes since the 16th century that do not pass in a particularly favorable light, so that the papal rights to rule on the Irish as much as the English church were deeply criticized. But what cannot actually be adopted, which was done in the 19th century before historiography went further, was the very existence of the laudabiliter bulla, which objectively we do not have, but is confirmed by multiple evidence, including the letters of the same Pope Alexander III. So the bulla was issued, and definitely Rome was acting in cooperation with England, also as far as the organization of the Lordship of Ireland and its local church were concerned. The papal power to grant also fell within the remit of the Dictatus Papae, right? That was issued in 1075 during the Gregorian Reform. It's perfectly in line with the temper of the time, both from lay and ecclesiastical authorities. While the Laudabiliter Bulla had referred to the Kingdom of Ireland, the papacy was still ambiguous about continuing to describe it as a kingdom as early as 1185, for reasons that we will partially explain now, that, as you understand, have to do with the relative lack of interest, actually, of the English monarchy per se, just in a broader dominion or commitment, at least, in Ireland, right, over in Ireland. And that's how somehow the English presence remained confined, at least as far as the direct monarchic control around the Pale was concerned. In fact, having captured just this small part of Ireland on the east coast, Henry used this area to solve a dispute dividing his family, right? For he had divided his territories between his sons, with the youngest being nicknamed Johann Sans-Terre, so John Lackland, that we also made, we didn't make a video on it, it was one on the Angevins, but Edward the First was entrusted by his father, Henry III, with the Lordship of Ireland, probably as the continuing of a tradition, right, dating back to John, right, as a bit of school of expertise, because it was difficult to rule there, and Edward the First, at least, wouldn't be particularly committed in Ireland after his junior age, but probably the experience he accumulated there was relevant as far as also his exploit in Britain against the Scots, etc., were concerned. And the reason why, of course, John Lackland is called like that is not that he actually didn't have any land, but it was the last to get one, right, as he was the youngest of Henry II's children. Actually, his father's favorite, telling the truth. And that's why Henry spent himself to see his son recognized. In fact, at the Oxford Parliament in May 1177, Henry replaced William Fitz-Aldham as Lord of Ireland and granted John the Irish lands, so becoming the Dominus Hibernia in 1177. This was the title properly used, because Dominus stands for a king who has not yet been crowned, right? At the time, consider John was 10-year old, right? And Henry had wanted him to be crowned king on his first visit that occurred in 1185. But on that occasion, Pope Lucius III specifically refused permission, which was probably due to a papal internal issue as far as this new dominion was concerned, right? Because the same Lucius III doubted the validity of Hadrian IV's concessions. The reason may have been the fact again that after all, the English controlled just a very small part of the island, that in fact a kingdom should have been based on some broader institutional base, right, that the High Kingship of Ireland also quite couldn't provide, and that also probably the Angevins would have not adopted for themselves, because again, you needed to be elected in a way, and the same Irish had hardly ever had a unitary domain on the island through even the same High Kingship, so it was too complicated, right? What's the Anglo-Normans were habituated to was properly asserting a dominion, right? In England, they had found an importantly developed institutional administrative system, so there was a kingdom of England already, and everything followed smoothly. In Ireland, everything was more complicated, right? Interestingly enough, Pope Lucius III died while John was in Ireland, right? And that's when Henry finally obtained consent from Pope III to crown his son as king. And that's why he ordered also a crown of gold and peacock feathers for the would-be monarch. In late 1185, this crown was ready, but by that point, John's visit in Ireland had been so disastrous politically that Henry cancelled the coronation, because it was just beyond fiction at that point to pretend that there was a stable, solid monarchy of Ireland in the person of John, right? This was occurring naturally where the Angevins had huge problems elsewhere, and again, Ireland represented somehow the last even of the inheritances here that were to be provided to the latter son of the king. Following the deaths of John's older brothers, Henry and Richard, he became King of England in 1199. Right. Thus, what happened as a sole ruler is that the Lordship of Ireland, instead of being a separate country ruled by, was seen just as a junior Norman prince that had to be more or less accepted by the local community, came under the direct rule of the Angevin crown altogether. So in the legal terminology of John's successor, the Lordship of Ireland, that is somehow generic term, as you understand, refer to the sovereignty vested in the crown of England, right? So what the English monarch was collecting outside the country, like just as a personal possession, right? And sometimes the lordship was known simply as the land of Ireland, just to tell you how, non-institutional, right, compared to what we're habituated in terms properly of nation state and whatever, this possession really was. And as we've seen, the Anglo-Normans, the Angevins had always considered, even the same England, it was normal at the time, just as a private personal possession, right, as far properly as the regnum, as the rule was concerned. The same was true for Ireland, and at that point, of course, the English kings were powerful enough to maintain control, largely at least of the main center of the island and the coastline from which the resources of at least the most productive hinterlands could be told, and that was what essentially the English kings were mostly interested in, right? In the process, of course, the Anglo-Normans kept essentially expanding within the Irish hinterland, right? This process is the same one for which many Irish surnames still today are after Norman names such as Burke, Roche, Power, while of course the wilder hinterland that could be hardly controlled even by the most enterprising invaders would maintain more strictly Gaelic cultural background. There was a blend, as we will see now better, but essentially the peripheral areas would remain detached from the Pale, from in fact where most of resources and also population were concentrated, not just as a process of the Anglo-Norman immigration. Consider that, as we were saying before, the 12th to 13th century were a moment of great development in Europe and of great expansion that very often wasn't, say, dictated by particular improvements, let's say in the crop rates or anything, but brought people to simply augment, thus new lands to be necessary for them, and this process was managed by the feudal elite, right? The English established properly a Parliament of Ireland, which first sat in 1297. At this point, some of the most important counties were created by shiring, right? And what you can see all across Norman Ireland is, of course, these walled towns and castles, just as a feature of the landscape, which in their, aside from the romantic scenery, are quite grimly and evidently telling the history of a heavy militarization, right? These structures were evidently built with pretty strong defensive purpose, but also, of course, one of domination over the surrounding territory in a condition of permanent instability, right, where you had literally to check continuous guerrilla warfare raids. That's what the Irish did on a regular basis, also against one another, cattle raiding. I made multiple videos about Irish warfare at this point, and it's really fascinating because basically even the Gaelic chieftains, of course, adopted the most updated Frankish panoply that the Normans were bringing. Just this happened by a much lesser scale. The same cavalry actually was not particularly present in Gaelic warfare, even though, of course, the equestrian military culture of the Indo-European background, interestingly mixed with also some pre-Celtic one, had maintained prominent, like as in practically all European cultures. But most Irish were essentially infantry. They had initially faced the Normans in open field, and the enemy heavy cavalry had well proven the civilizational advancement of the conquerors, for which the Irish tended from there on, after again this main centers that could put together more troops and facing the English in pitched battles were subjugated, just obliged, right, to carry out this hit and run strategy and tactics. Ireland, as you know, was covered in forests, where these people lived even with this hidden paths that they knew by heart. They had a prearranged kind of set for fireplaces, so that they knew, of course, the spaces that were not particularly vast, also considering, in fact, the parcelization of clanic territorial control, but were known inch by inch, right, differently from the invaders that gradually would learn of that as well, but still had the upper hand with the heavy cavalry, and thanks to their connections abroad and so on, they were just the most powerful in the area. But guerrilla is a strong form of war and can wear out occupation forces even during the centuries of formal domination. The general expansion of feudalism in Ireland, aside from having its limits in the dynamics that we just outlined, was naturally carried out through the intense exploitation of what the Normans called the mere Irish, that is to say, the pure ones, the local Gaels, from Latin merus, which means, in fact, mere, pure, that were seen just naturally as the lesser people of the subjugated, and in the process, naturally, the Normans also altered the entire Gaelic political and social system, right? Even just deforestation, right, and the settlement of other people from overseas, etc., was an important dynamic, and naturally opened Ireland to an important degree of civilization, yet not immediately, of course, succeeding in bringing this to a level that could make the conquerors afford, in fact, a complete control on the system. Consider the Norman elite and churchmen spoke Norman French and Latin. Many poorer settlers from the same Norman side spoke English, Welsh, Flemish, as we've seen before, while the Gaelic areas spoke Irish dialects that, as you know, still today, if you look at the linguistic map of Ireland, you can see how they fundamentally preserve themselves. In fact, in the more sheltered areas, the ones that were essentially less in contact with the English, either by direct occupation or just by geographical proximity. And there are interesting cultural legacies. For example, the Yola language of the County Wexford, that is a survivor of the early English dialects in Ireland. We have the Kildare poems dating from the mid-14th century that are written in Middle English as humorous local literature. So, of course, that was a word that in part, of course, has disappeared as well, but reflecting the process of cultural stratification that took place in Ireland. As we were saying before, during 1315, 1318, the lordship per se suffered the invasion from Scotland by Edward Bruce, which devastated much of the island economy, telling the truth. And there were important ramifications of this. The historical context is known. At this point, Robert Bruce had, as we were saying before, secured essentially Scottish independence, and thought to pass on the offensive by sending his brother in Ireland to challenge the Angevin dominion. Another reason why the Scots intervened in Ireland is that the Balliol, that were essentially the rival family of the Bruce that had initially been supported and had actually received the same Scottish crown by Edward I, had been supported. They had fought at Bannockburn against, in fact, the same Bruce and so on, had taken refuge in Ireland, right? And there were many other reasons. Of course, the Gaelic chieftains wanted to get rid, in great part, of the Hiberno-Normans. So after the important defeat of the English in 1314, it was a good moment to press on the offensive. The expedition, however, ended in disaster. At least, there wasn't any substantial accomplishment, nor the capacity to dislodge the English from Ireland, because, yes, Scotland was now starting to properly affirm itself as a much more structured feudal monarchy with an important degree of autonomy also from the English than it had ever enjoyed. But the thing just ended up destroying the country in great part. This naturally brought some damage to the same lordship. In fact, not just many Gaelic leaders managed to seize a relevant part of the territories previously controlled by the Anglo-Normans, but the latter lords began to rebel to the same English monarchy, right, and not achieving, in fact, the match just per se, but the power of the governor on the rest of the country that shrank. These, as we were saying before, were the same years of the Great Famine, for which it became difficult from Ireland, and especially from these more kind of Anglo-Norman controlled areas to import enough wheat. Bare necessities that were usually, in fact, depending on from the abroad, thus reducing that modest settled capacity that had brought the Pale to remain essentially the avant-post of English control over the island. The earldom of Ulster, that had suffered dramatically from Bruce's invasion, ended in 1333. The Black Death impacted more on the town-dwelling Normans than on the remaining Gaelic clans. Black Death in Ireland arrived in 1348-1350. And obviously, again, this hit the most populated areas, right? The more concentrated communities, again, so at the detriment more of the rulers than the rest of the inhabitants that mostly lived in more sparsely in more distant communities. The Norman and English colonists exhibited a tendency to adopt much of native culture and language on the long run, thus becoming Gaelicized, or in the words of some, becoming more Irish than the Irish themselves, naturally pointing at the fact, as we were saying before, that it was important, as an Anglo-Norman whose house had settled in Ireland from centuries, to reinforce its own prerogatives by, generally speaking, exploiting this tension between the lordship and the native Gaels, right, and thus adopting part also their culture, their customs. They were pretty warlike, right? So the same Anglo-Normans had to adapt to that political landscape that was continuously strained, right? And that did offer some opportunities, but also a great risk. So they weren't particularly scared also of the governor's actions per se, and this shrinking of the same lordship naturally created a gap, or at least conferred to the lesser rulers kind of more power, as we've seen many times with the crisis of the 14th century. What happens is that the great universal powers and the overlordships in general do not have enough resources to extend very much. So the frontier, and what a better frontier than Ireland, politically and culturally, would autonomize, and especially powers would be ever more rooted locally, territorially, as opposed to like this kind of more distant, kind of decentralized dominations. So this is the late medieval picture in Ireland mostly, because this gradual erosion of the lordship is becoming self-evident, right? It's just like a sort of avampost centered around Dublin, and subcontracted also to fundamentally other lords, as we'll see now, that were mostly living nearby, but were a bit in between the two worlds. As a reaction, we were remembering before in 1366 there is the statute of Kilkenny that tried in vain, however, to keep the traits of Gaelic culture and the Norman ones separated, so that mixed identity wouldn't form as a new political actor. But it was de facto impossible and to control. The Norman lordships in Ireland became thus increasingly Gaelicized. They made alliances with native chiefs, the power of which also increased, because the crisis had naturally struck also the Gaelic world, and the consolidation of lordships as a consequence of the weakening of the middle classes with the economic and demographic crisis would extend exactly in that territorial base some, in fact, chiefdoms that had developed out of essentially clinic tribal bases and evolving towards a more seigneurial princely direction, right? Additionally, the Angevin government became ever more strange to the local affairs, right? It alienated the Irish chiefs and people, and this had been traditionally the military strength of the same lordship. It was a process, of course, stemming from the aforementioned dynamics, but also from the, state building of the English monarchy that tended towards an ever more systematic and somehow uniform type of control and administration that naturally was imposing itself in a reality that was quite different, of course, from England per se. The most important Hiberno-Norse areas, so were the greatest blend between the conquerors and the natives had occurred, were Leinster, so including Meath and Ossory, Munster, and some parts of Connacht. On the base of the pre-Norman Irish politics, it had been easy to, in fact, install oneself as a lord over these pre-existing chiefdoms that didn't have practically much of a sense of a broader, let's say, a unitary Gaelic identity from a political point of view, and that were regularly involved, as we've seen before, in fighting and mercenarism, home as abroad, and shifting alliances. This was the norm. But the same Norman rule had, of course, from one side, taught the Irish how to unite under a greater pressure, which was the one definitely that the English government was enforcing, thus triggering open rebellions against the crown. From this mixed background, some of the more notable among the clans that had formerly cooperated with the English, but that exactly for this reason began to be more alienated from them in an openly anti-Norman direction, because they had to learn from them how to rule more effectively. And this is the interesting aspect of the story, where definitely the O'Connor Fellis, the MacMurrough-Kavanagh dynasts, the Byrnes, the O'Moores, and the Loys, these clans were able to essentially defend successfully their territories against the English attacks, in part because they were naturally resilient with that guerrilla warfare we were describing before, but also because the Anglo-Norman lords very often had a few resources at their disposal and actually didn't fight that differently sometimes. Also because, as we've just seen, they often employed Irish troops themselves, and that's the deal. It was just there were instances in which, as we'll see now, just Anglo-Normans fought against each other, and the subject Irish exploited that to side with one or the other to aggrandize themselves through that same their Anglo-Norman domination. So it's very complicated, and that's why we have to eventually make more videos on this, because the entire history is very interesting. And there was an important degree of properly military colonization, if you want. Aside from the military architecture that you can still admire in Ireland and that I uploaded pictures of here, you have to consider that properly it was population displacement, often immigration from overseas that were politically and strategically used to properly even carry out some sort of cultural engineering, right, and replacement, substitution. This would go on, as you know, if you study Irish history also in the modern age. You know that there were different communities, even coming from Scotland, somehow having very different allegiances, that eventually with the Reformation things got even more complicated, but that's in fact to be left for some other point. And there was of course an increase in Irish powers, as we were saying before, especially through the O'Neills, the O'Donnells, that would become once again, as it had been before English domination, and by some degree even under them, but again in players on the scene of the country politics. Right, so there is definitely a Gaelic revival / resurgence between the mid-14th and the 16th century. That, again, is a product of that decentralization, territorialization, and so on. And that is, of course, not anymore what had been, the Gaelic world before, but now an unavoidable mix, right, just with the Anglo-Normans themselves. Even as far as the Pale was concerned, its territorial extension shrunk to a small area, basically just around Dublin, right? During the first half of the 16th century, this mix showed its features, because most clans remained actually loyal to the English crown most of the time. Objectively, the presence of an overlordship was an opportunity, as always, for just like the high kingship of Ireland had always been, for anyone to promote oneself. Like, you can resist to the high king by simply hoping to become the next one, and this competition would gradually strengthen the institution per se, and also the power of whoever was being co-opted by it. Doesn't matter how, again, fragmentary the Irish government had really been. In this early 16th century, there was still a pretty traditionally Gaelic system of alliances based on mutual favors, clientelage, and so on, centered, however, on the Lord Deputy of Ireland, who at this point was usually the current Earl of Kildare, that ruled essentially just in the south west of the Pale, and thus was also just closer to Dublin's policy. The Battle of Knockdoe in 1504 is a good example of these mechanisms, as you see the burghs in Galway that emerge, coming to threaten some other clans that were seen by the Lord Deputy as, and also, by themselves as a threat to the same, of course, English rule, within which some of these other clans were thriving, at least were being co-opted by. This battle was pretty bloody and interesting. We could even discuss it. The burghs were defeated, and eventually, kind of for decades, they remained in obscurity after this. And sometimes you would think, even from a strictly military historical point of view, these were just a bit more than brawls, right? But if you look at Gaelic warfare and its hardcore nature, you realize how refinedly brutal it was, as far as properly as these figures. Think about the Gallowglasses, the properly this type of still almost heroic warfare that had remained deeply ingrained in the deeper veins of Gaelic military culture. Again, double-handed swordsmen literally chopping themselves to pieces and keeping to fight even with limbs cut off and all this stuff, and baths of blood that are described sometimes in horrifying ways. We've seen in that video about, in fact, the West Highlanders were pretty similar. So of course, in that case, the burghs had just represented some of the most aggressive Gaelic, say, forces, but the kind of the average brutality was definitely pretty high elsewhere. In 1535, there was a rebellion by the 9th Earls, Hare, Silken Thomas, so-called, because his troops wore a silk fringe on their helmets, which began to express, or to catalyze at least, a greater opposition to a system that was now based mainly on English-born administrators in Ireland, right? And of course, the country was paying for its backwardness at that point, because England naturally had suffered heavy blows as far as the 100 Years' War was concerned. Also, the Wars of the Roses were not so, let's say, detrimental to the political institutional system. Actually, the bath of blood in the House of the Lords brought to a greater centralization, but naturally kept the English kingdom busy, while these other territories were the Celtic French, which is basically the only frontier that had remained to them abroad, were concerned. However, the Tudors at this point carry out, just like in England, in Ireland, the seizure of all the monasteries around 1540, followed to essentially the Anglican schism. That's basically what the Tudor did. It just, there was the chronic problems of medieval and now Renaissance modern monarchies, that they didn't have essentially steady tax revenues, etc. So they thought to follow the trail of the Reformation, to simply confiscate all the monasteries, and then we blame the stewards as those who try to enforce actually more modern systems of government and were overthrown eventually for England to pay even more than what the miserable ship money would have actually been. But actually the Tudors had just leaped off of this confiscations, not really solved the problem at the root. So today we stop, of course, to the modern age, but it's worth mentioning how the transformation of the lordship into a kingdom really occurred, right? Because the title of Lord of Ireland was changed by the Crown Ireland Act, passed by the same Irish Parliament in 1542, as on the King Henry VIII's demand. This was granted a new title, probably the one of King of Ireland, right? Thus, also the country was factually renamed as the Kingdom of Ireland, which pointed also at the more unitary political and territorial framing of the island that now was ever more difficultly escaping to the games of modern powers as just a decentralized area. This is interesting also for another reason, because changing the title of Lord of Ireland meant to also increase indirectly royal power as far as the papacy was concerned, because the title of Lord had been granted to the Norman monarchy, as we've seen, by the Holy See, right? At this point, as you know, Henry VIII was excommunicated by the Catholic Church, and he could play also on this to essentially do a bit what he wanted as a response. There was, of course, also an effort by Henry to instill in the Irish a greater unitary sense, still, of course, in favor of the English monarchy, to simply rule them better, right? And this naturally did happen, as we've seen moments in which rebellions to English rule were already something, right? And the main way the English fundamentally ruled Ireland was the so-called surrender and grant. That is to say, if you basically accept that I'm your overlord, I will simply maintain your own institutions, just as if I had given them to you and not they had existed before. And this is an interesting, attitude in the first place, because it shows how, again, the Normans, the English had essentially just stepped in simply considering these lands something completely belonging to them, right? And thus that literally belonged to the Crown of England, whoever wore it. In 1542, with the creation of the kingdom, also a Royal Irish Army was established, right? Which naturally was mostly functional to the repression of the local rebellions. So I guess this is just a picture that we can draw quite sketchily about the Lordship of Ireland in this case. There is a lot to say about medieval Irish history, telling the truth, that is somehow overlooked, because you may think it's a peripheral area and also a relatively underdeveloped one, but the question is also, how complex was it to govern it, and how much work there was behind these institutions, which is rarely appreciated, compared in fact to areas that were, again, more developed, and that in the sense were more habituated to be ruled. But how hard was to mold the system into something more manageable is quite fascinating throughout medieval history. And there is the same is valid just from a Gaelic perspective, because at the end of the day, everybody tries to kind of establish a more unitary government of some sort, and this, as you know, during literally the millennia, had taken quite a fascinating picture that in the survival, some this primitive elements in Irish politics, military, and society is worth considering also in a comparative way. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.